academics that have done this over the years that have tried to delineate that. The earliest one that I'm aware of was David Russell's 1961 paper. I'm not going to read through these lists, though. They're actually pretty interesting, but I do want to highlight a few of these along the way. For example, the second item on his list was Thorndike's paper. And Russell attributed this to our awareness of comprehension problems and to our addressing it. I've always sort of thought that what really came out of that particular paper was the emphasis on use of questions for teaching reading comprehension and so on. So you can characterize these various ways. Another one that I'd like to highlight is the diagnostic reading assessment, and the reason I want to mention that one is because, as you'll see, it comes up later again in another context. Terman and Lima's paper on reading interests that Russell thought was so important. Essentially what Russell had done is he'd been talking to a school superintendent who'd kind of poo-pooed the effects of research on schools, and Russell sent out to try to prove it by showing 10 instances where it had made a difference. Unfortunately, at least a couple of his examples weren't actually examples of the research making any difference. So Nyla Banton-Smith's study on her historical analysis of instructional methods, he just, actually it turned out to be a really nice example of the historical method in education, which isn't exactly what he set out to do. And same thing with the final study, the International Dimensions for the Future, Gray's work for UNESCO. It was sort of this sort of gives hope for the future. It doesn't have any impact, but what a nice study, and maybe we can be more international as we go forward. So you get the idea. One last one I want to just point out, and that was the Phonics one. And the reason I point that out isn't really about the content, but about he attributed it to Agnew, though he admitted that in fact there were a lot of papers on phonics, there was a lot of research on phonics. He wasn't really quite sure why he was picking that one. It wasn't real specific, but he sort of kicked things off with this paper. Harry Singer did a series of papers responding to this later on, trying to make a sense of Russell's criteria and so on. And one of the things he did is he went through a set of studies that research that he thought should have made a difference, that fit all of the kind of criteria that Russell set, but in fact hadn't been influential. And also a couple that he thought had made a difference but shouldn't have, which is kind of an interesting notion. The reading readiness concept from Morfitt and Washburn, and the use of configuration as included decoding of Cattell's work. More recently, Susan Newman and I tried our hand at this exercise, and we came up, we couldn't get it down to 10. We came up with 13 since the original Russell paper. And again, let me just pick a few of these to highlight. There are some items in here that I would argue they're more acts of scholarship than they are formal empirical research. They don't necessarily, all of these rely on particular methods or item number 8, the role of prior knowledge in reading comprehension. This is one that we did essentially what Russell did with Agnew. There are an awful lot of papers around that time, that we could have attributed this kind of thing to, which one did we like best? It wasn't necessarily a lot deeper than that. Let me just jump back. I want to the Durkin one, the demise of the reading readiness concept. Her early reading paper. I think this is an important one, given that notion that Morfitt and Washburn have had this big impact where you're going to start teaching reading readiness. You're going to spend a lot of time preparing kids to get ready so that they could benefit from reading instruction. And Durkin's study seems to push the world in a different direction and says, wait a minute, you don't necessarily have to go through that. Kids seem to be able to learn literacy earlier than folks had perhaps thought. And I'd say the same thing about another study by Durkin, Explicit Teaching of Reading Comprehension, which in some ways took what Thorndike created and rejected it as instruction and said, no, we really need to teach in a very different way, which is this sort of pattern of how these things change is I think, kind of interesting. One more of these, and that is the Fordham Foundation. Theirs was tied specifically, they commissioned a study to figure out which studies, which research in the field of education, not just in literacy, in the field of education, had an impact, not necessarily on practice, but on policy. And the reason I've thrown this one up here is, one, because it was policy focused, but also because a lot of these are very specifically literacy, or in part or fully. The national assessment, they claim has been the most influential policy research, and I think that's probably true. Obviously, a lot of that is the assessment of reading. Or the number 3 item on there, the National Reading Panel report that Leslie alluded to. Group brought together by the government to review research in a formal way, not to recommend policies, but just to make a determination of fact about what the research said, that in fact policies were made on the basis of. The class size studies in Tennessee, that the outcome measure was reading more often than anything else. The Snow report, preventing reading difficulties, and so on. These days, the teacher quality studies and reports, and so on. Some newer candidates, and these haven't been vetted by anybody but me. But these are just some ideas. The Reading First Impact Study, certainly, if the National Reading Panel was influential of policy, one of the ways it was influential was in the creation of Reading First. And I would argue that the Reading First Impact Study was very persuasive to Congress when children weren't comprehending any better by 3rd grade in the schools that were getting that money. That was influential of the policy in the other direction. RTI and tiered models, guided reading has certainly swept the schools. Technology coming into instruction, probably lots of examples there, but I think maybe the most persuasive one, the most related to research, both as a formative to the development of that program, but also studying that program, the work at Vanderbilt on cognition and technology. The Lexile framework, which I think is becoming, which is really an improvement of the technology of measuring readability. On that list of Russell's, he had the 1935 study of Gray and Leary, which was, to my way of thinking of the early readability studies, probably the very best one, suggesting that we could measure the difficulty of text and that would have some value in education. The Lexile framework essentially has improved that technology. They can now explain something like 75% of the variance in reading comprehension, which is a lot better than they used to be able to do. Curriculum-based measurement. Gee, isn't that diagnostic teaching stuff from earlier? I mean, it seems like we keep winning some of these battles, and it's probably a little early to throw Common Core standards on this one, but I think it's not an unreasonable item to put on the list. When you look at these studies and papers and so on that are being influential, it makes you wonder, why are some things influential and others aren't? And I'd like to pull a few lessons from these. And one of them is that it seems easier to ascribe research influences over policy than on practice. The reason for that being, when you want to look at the impacts on policy, it's pretty much a document search. I mean, you can honestly see in law where particular reports are cited, or in the congressional record where particular reports are cited. In practice, it's a different thing. You have to both have a pretty strong sense of what schools have been doing and how that has changed. And for most of us, we don't have that kind of breadth of experience. We don't get into the literally tens of thousands of schools and classrooms, and so we don't quite know, where we, what's really changed. A lot of this is local, and the things that happen. Of course, ascribing or attributing research influences to policy is tricky in a different way. While it's really easy to see what what's being cited and so on, What you don't always know is whether that research actually led to the policy, or whether the policy went searching for a bit of research to support it. One suspects that if somebody were to do a research study right now, finding out that firing teachers or closing schools was a really good idea, in a few years we'd be attributing such policies to that research. It might be backwards. Another thing that becomes pretty obvious if you look through those lists of you know, what we were saying we thought had been influential is that very much like in that Agnew case or that Pickert and Anderson case and in several others, it's really collections of studies that are being influential. Sometimes that's obvious in something like the National Reading Panel report where they, you know, you go through and you review 200 or 300 studies. But it's also true in those cases where we've attributed outcomes to a specific study when in fact there were maybe dozens of studies done by that researcher and others that are really what are being influential. Individual studies have had less and less impact if you look at those lists that I showed you, and that's especially true in policy. But sponsored data analysis, collective reports, summaries, the kind of thing that Leslie mentioned in her introduction are really, they've grown in influence. If you want to see our work having an impact, it really does require that a lot more folks have their hands on it. I think that's a good change. Another point, there are no final victories. Changes that were influenced by research are often overturned later by other changes also influenced by research. You know, we're kind of like democracy. Oh, that's nice. Now people can actually hear the final slide. You would have loved the earlier parts, folks. You've been very polite. My final slide is, thank you. I think this is the final slide. Influence, this is, I think, the most important one, and that is influence is not the same as effectiveness. Despite the fact that lots of scholarship has influenced practices and policies over the years, we still haven't reliably or consistently improved reading achievement for appreciable numbers of our kids. And so while I can document why particular studies or particular reports have been influential, influence is not the same as effectiveness, and we need to find a way to turn all of this data collection and analysis and all of your good work into something that really does make things better for kids. Thank you very much.